At Elena Vasquez's graduation party, 60-year-old diner manager Aida Miller was about to discover the true cost of unconditional love. For 3 years, she had sacrificed her retirement savings to fund her niece's UCLA dreams, working double shifts and postponing her own future. When Sophia publicly dismissed her as embarrassing in front of wealthy classmates, Aida faced the cruelest betrayal imaginable. Her cold response that night would devastate more than just hurt feelings. She would walk away with every dollar of Sophia's $47,000 college fund. What began as family devotion became calculated revenge, forever changing both women's understanding of loyalty, respect, and the true price of dignity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee machine at Miller's Diner had been making that grinding noise for 3 weeks, but Aida Miller couldn't afford to replace it. Not when every dollar counted towards something more important than her own comfort. She wiped down the counter for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Her movements automatic after 15 years of managing this place, while her mind calculated numbers that never seemed to add up the way she needed them to. Friday evening rush was winding down, the usual mix of truckers and locals settling their tabs and heading home to families. Aida watched them go with the practiced detachment of someone who'd learned not to dwell on what she didn't have. Frank Torres emerged from the kitchen, his chef's apron stained with the evidence of another busy shift, concern etched in the lines around his dark eyes. "You've been checking your phone every 5 minutes," he said, sliding a fresh cup of coffee across the counter. "Sophia again?" Aida's fingers tightened around her phone. The last text from her niece had been brief. "Party starts at 7. Mom said you might come." Not an invitation exactly, more like an afterthought. "Carmen mentioned the graduation party," Aida said, her voice carrying that edge Frank had learned to recognize. "Apparently I'm expected to make an appearance." Frank studied her face the way he studied a new recipe, carefully, looking for the ingredients that would make everything work. "You don't sound thrilled about it." 18-year-olds and their wealthy friends celebrating futures I'm funding. The bitterness slipped out before she could stop it. "What's not to love?" The diner's bell chimed as the last customer left, and Aida moved to flip the sign to closed. Through the window she could see her reflection, 60 years old, graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a uniform that smelled like French fries and other people's dreams. Not exactly graduation party material. "When's the last time you did something for yourself?" Frank asked quietly. "And I mean something that wasn't about work or Sophia or keeping everyone else afloat." The question hit harder than it should have. Aida turned away, busying herself with wiping tables that were already clean. "I do plenty for myself. Name one thing." "In the last month." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. When had she last bought herself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary? When had she last gone anywhere that wasn't work or family obligation? "This isn't about me," she said finally. "It's about Sophia's future." "And what about your future?" Frank's voice was gentle but persistent. "What about your retirement? Your savings?" Aida's laugh was hollow. "What retirement? What savings?" She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened her banking app, the numbers staring back at her like an accusation. Her personal account, $247.82. The joint account she'd set up for Sophia's college fund, $47,000, every cent earned through double shifts, skipped meals and postponed dreams. "Jesus, Aida." Frank had seen the screen over her shoulder. "You've got nothing left for yourself." "I've got enough." The lie came easily, practiced. She'd been telling it for 3 years, ever since Michael's funeral when everything changed. The memory hit her without warning, as it always did. Standing in the cemetery, Carmen's mascara streaking down her cheeks, while Sophia clung to her mother's arm. 18 years old and suddenly fatherless, looking at Aida with eyes that held too much hope and not enough understanding of what that hope would cost. "I can't afford UCLA," Carmen had whispered between sobs. "Michael left us with nothing but debt. What am I going to tell her?" And Aida, still numb from losing her baby brother, had heard herself making promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "Don't worry about Sophia's education. I'll take care of everything." 3 words that had defined every decision since. Every overtime shift, every skipped vacation, Every time she'd chosen instant coffee over the good stuff because $20 here and there added up to Sophia's future. "You remember what I told you about my daughter?" Frank's voice pulled her back to the present. "About how she didn't appreciate what I did for her until after her mother and I divorced?" Aida nodded. Frank's ex-wife had poisoned their daughter against him during the proceedings, turning his sacrifices into weapons. It had taken years for them to rebuild their relationship. "She called me last week," he continued, "thanked me for paying for her nursing degree, said she finally understood what it cost me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But you know what she also said? She said she wishes I hadn't given up so much of my own life for hers. That watching me sacrifice everything made her feel guilty, not grateful. Sophia's different." But even as Aida said it, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. "Skip the party," Frank said suddenly. "Come have dinner with me instead, that new place on Maple Street. Cloth napkins, wine list, the whole thing." The offer was tempting, more tempting than it should be. When was the last time a man had asked her to dinner? When was the last time she'd sat across from someone who saw her as more than a means to an end? "I can't. Sophia's expecting me." "Is she? Or is Carmen expecting you to show up because that's what you always do?" The question stung because it was fair. Sophia hadn't called to invite her personally, hadn't mentioned being excited to see her. The party was at Elena Vasquez's house, the kind of place where Aida would stick out like a coffee stain on white linen. "She needs to know I support her," Aida said, but her voice lacked conviction. "There's a difference between supporting someone and erasing yourself for them." Frank moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You've been disappearing piece by piece for 3 years. How much of yourself is left to give?" Quote. Aida looked down at her hands, calloused from work, wedding ring finger bare after 6 decades of putting everyone else first. She thought about her apartment, small and practical, furnished with hand-me-downs and clearance finds. She thought about her retirement plan, which consisted entirely of hoping she could work until she died. "I made a promise," she said quietly. "To Michael, or to yourself?" The distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit. Michael, charming and irresponsible, who'd always relied on his big sister to bail him out of financial trouble. Who'd died owing more money than he'd ever earned, leaving behind a wife and daughter who expected Aida to keep solving problems that weren't hers to solve. Frank reached across the counter and covered her hand with his. "You don't owe them your entire life." But even as warmth spread from his touch, Aida was already shaking her head. "I'm going to the party. Sophia's graduating, and I should be there." Frank's face fell, but he didn't argue. "Want me to drive you? Keep you company?" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "This is family business." She saw the hurt in his eyes before he could hide it, and felt the familiar twist of guilt in her stomach. Frank was the closest thing to family she had outside of blood relations, but somehow that made it easier to disappoint him. "I should get home," she said, untying her apron. "Need to find something appropriate to wear to a party where teenagers discuss their trust funds." Frank watched her gather her things, and she could feel his disapproval like a weight on her shoulders. But he was wrong. Family came first. It always had in the Miller household. Her mother Rosa had drilled that into her from childhood, working 3 jobs to keep Aida and Michael fed and clothed. The difference was, Rosa had been building something. Aida was just trying to keep the pieces from falling apart. She paused at the door, keys in hand, looking back at Frank one last time. He was loading dishes into the dishwasher, his movements sharp with frustration. "Frank?" He looked up, hope flickering in his expression. "The coffee machine really does need fixing. Order a new one Monday morning." It wasn't what either of them wanted her to say, but it was all she could manage. Some promises mattered more than others, and tonight she would honor the one that had been costing her everything. The bell chimed behind her as she stepped into the cooling evening air, heading home to dress for a party where she would smile and pretend her sacrifice meant something to the girl who no longer saw it as one. Aida's reflection stared back at her from the bathroom mirror, and she didn't like what she saw. The navy blue dress, her only nice outfit, hung on her frame like it was apologizing for existing. She'd bought it 3 years ago for Michael's funeral and hadn't worn it since. The fabric was good quality, but the cut was practical rather than fashionable, the kind of dress that said, responsible adult rather than celebration. She dabbed concealer under her eyes, trying to hide the exhaustion that seemed permanently etched there. Her hands, no matter how much lotion she used, still bore the calluses and small burns from years of restaurant work. These were working hands, and no amount of polish could disguise that fact. The GPS on her phone guided her through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, each turn taking her further from anything familiar. The houses grew larger, the lawns more manicured, the cars in driveways worth more than she made in 2 years. By the time she reached Ridgeview Heights, Aida felt like she was entering a different country entirely. Elena Vasquez's house wasn't just large, it was an architectural statement. Modern lines and floor-to-ceiling windows suggested a casual relationship with money that Aida couldn't fathom. The circular driveway was already crowded with vehicles, BMWs, Audis, a Tesla that probably cost more than Sophia's entire college fund. Aida's 10-year-old Honda looked like an apology among them. She sat in her car for a moment, watching through the massive windows as teenagers moved through spaces that seemed designed for magazine photo shoots. These kids wore their privilege like a second skin, comfortable in a way that spoke of never having to consider the cost of anything. Their casual clothes probably cost more than Aida's monthly rent. A valet approached her window, an actual valet at a teenage party, and Aida realized she was blocking the driveway. She fumbled for her keys, embarrassed by the contrast between her practical Honda and the luxury vehicles surrounding it. "Good evening, ma'am," the young man said politely. "Are you here for the Vasquez celebration?" "Yes," Aida managed, though she suddenly felt like an imposter. "I'm Sophia Martinez's aunt." His smile was professional but confused, as if he couldn't quite place how she fit into this particular social ecosystem. She handed over her keys and accepted the valet ticket, feeling ridiculous about the entire transaction. The front door opened before she could ring the bell, revealing Elena herself. 18 years old, with the kind of effortless beauty that came from good genetics and better skincare, she wore a dress that probably cost more than Aida made in a month. "You must be Sophia's aunt." Elena's enthusiasm seemed genuine, though there was something in her tone that made Aida feel like an exotic exhibit. "I'm Elena. Thank you so much for coming. Sophia's told me so much about her family." Aida doubted that was entirely true, but she smiled and followed Elena into a foyer that could have housed her entire apartment. The ceiling soared 2 stories, and a chandelier that belonged in a palace cast warm light over marble floors. The sound of conversation and laughter echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, punctuated by music that managed to be both sophisticated and age-appropriate. "Can I get you something to drink?" Elena asked as they walked through rooms that seemed designed to showcase wealth without appearing ostentatious. "We have wine, champagne, sparkling cider." "Water would be fine," Aida said, though she immediately regretted the choice. In a setting like this, water seemed like an admission of being out of place. Elena led her toward the back of the house, where floor-to-ceiling glass doors opened onto a backyard that looked like a resort. The pool was lit from within, creating an ethereal blue glow, and strategically placed landscape lighting turned the garden into something from a fairy tale. Teenagers clustered in small groups, their voices carrying the easy confidence of people who'd never worried about money. "Mrs. Martinez is over by the appetizer station," Elena said, pointing toward an elaborate outdoor kitchen setup where Carmen stood looking as uncomfortable as Aida felt. Carmen Martinez had clearly made an effort. Her hair was styled in a way that suggested a recent salon visit she probably couldn't afford, and her dress was new. Aida recognized the tags she'd tried to tuck out of sight. But despite her careful preparation, Carmen radiated the same fish-out-of-water energy that Aida felt. "Aida!" Carmen's relief was visible as she approached. "I was wondering if you'd make it." They embraced awkwardly, 2 working-class women trying to navigate a social situation that felt like a test they hadn't studied for. Carmen's perfume was slightly too strong, the kind that came from drugstore counters rather than department store cosmetics counters, and Aida caught the barely concealed anxiety in her sister-in-law's eyes. "Where's Sophia?" Aida asked, scanning the groups of teenagers. "Over there with her friends." Carmen gestured toward a cluster of girls near the pool. "She's been so excited about tonight." UCLA officially confirmed her acceptance yesterday. Aida found Sophia among the group and her breath caught. Her niece had transformed into someone she barely recognized. Gone was the girl who used to help her clear tables at the diner during summer breaks. This version of Sophia wore designer jeans and a top that probably cost more than Aida's car payment. Her hair styled in beachy waves that spoke of professional attention. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged in this rarefied air. "She looks..." Aida paused, searching for the right word. "Different." Carmen's smile was complicated. "Elena's been so generous. She took Sophia shopping last week, said it was an early graduation gift. I tried to say no, but you know how teenage girls are about clothes." Aida didn't know, actually. She'd never had teenage girls, had never been able to afford the kind of shopping trips that treated clothing as anything more than necessity. But she nodded anyway, watching as Sophia threw back her head and laughed at something one of her friends said. The gesture was practiced, performative in a way that suggested she'd been studying how to fit in. "Ladies!" A voice interrupted her observations. Elena's mother approached, wine glass in hand and smile perfectly calibrated to suggest warmth without intimacy. "You must be the famous Aunt Aida. I'm Miranda Vasquez. Elena has told us so much about Sophia's wonderful family." Miranda Vasquez was what Aida's mother would have called well-preserved, the kind of woman who aged gracefully because she could afford the best of everything. Her clothes were understated but clearly expensive, her jewelry real rather than costume, her confidence the sort that came from never having to worry about money. "Thank you for hosting," Aida said, accepting Miranda's perfectly manicured hand. "Your home is beautiful." "Oh, we love having the kids here," Miranda said, her tone suggesting that hosting parties was just another amenity she provided, like climate control or a well-stocked wine cellar. "And we think it's just wonderful what you've done for Sophia. Elena tells me you've been so supportive of her education." The words were meant as compliment, but something in Miranda's tone suggested she viewed Aida's sacrifices as quaint rather than necessary. Supporting a niece's education was probably the kind of thing Miranda did without thinking, writing checks without considering the cost. "Family takes care of family," Aida said simply. "Absolutely." Miranda's enthusiasm felt performative. "Though I have to say, what you've done is extraordinary. Elena mentioned that you work at a diner, the dedication it must take to save for college on that kind of salary. It's really quite inspiring." Aida felt heat rise in her cheeks. Miranda's tone suggested she was praising someone for overcoming a particularly challenging obstacle course, the obstacle being poverty. The older woman clearly meant well, but her words highlighted the vast difference between their worlds. "Aida's been amazing," Carmen interjected, though her voice lacked conviction. "Sophia is so lucky to have her support." "Of course she is," Miranda beamed. "And UCLA, what an achievement." "Elena's going to USC herself, but UCLA is certainly a fine school. Very accessible." The word accessible hung in the air like a judgment. Accessible meant affordable, meant state school, meant not quite good enough for families like the Vasquezes. Aida caught the subtle condescension and felt her jaw tighten. Before she could respond, a catering server approached with a tray of champagne flutes. "Champagne for the ladies? Oh, wonderful!" Miranda took a glass without hesitation. "We're celebrating our graduates tonight." Carmen looked uncertain but accepted a glass, clearly trying to fit in. When the server turned to Aida, she hesitated. Champagne at 6 in the evening felt decadent, inappropriate for someone who counted every dollar. "I'm driving," she said, though that wasn't entirely the truth. "Of course," Miranda said, though her tone suggested this was yet another way Aida didn't quite fit the evening's expectations. "How responsible." The server moved on. and Aida found herself holding her water glass like a prop in a play she didn't understand. Around them, parents and teenagers mingled with the easy familiarity of people who saw each other regularly at country clubs and charity events. Conversations flowed between college acceptances, summer plans in Europe, and internships at companies Aida had never heard of. "Oh, there's someone I want you to meet," Miranda said suddenly, gesturing toward an approaching couple. "David and Janet Chen. Their daughter is going to Stanford in the fall. David, Janet, meet Sophia's Aunt Aida. She's been funding Sophia's education. Such a inspiring story of family dedication." David and Janet Chen approached with the polite interest of people accustomed to meeting new additions to their social circle. They were younger than Miranda, probably in their 40s, with the casual sophistication that suggested tech money, the kind of wealth that dressed down but never doubted its own importance. "How wonderful," Janet said, her smile bright but somehow empty. "And you work in food service? That's so authentic." Authentic. As if Aida's work was a lifestyle choice rather than necessity. As if her calloused hands and tired feet were interesting cultural artifacts rather than the result of economic reality. "Aida manages Miller's Diner," Carmen offered, though her voice carried an apologetic undertone. "She's been there for 15 years. "How fascinating," David said, though his attention was already drifting toward more interesting conversations. "The service industry is so important. We really appreciate what you do." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. These people appreciated her the way they appreciated the landscaper, who kept their lawns perfect, necessary, occasionally worthy of gratitude, but not quite part of their world. Aida excused herself and moved toward the appetizer station, needing distance from the well-meaning condescension. The food was artfully arranged on gleaming platters, the kind of catering that probably cost more than she spent on groceries in a month. She selected a small plate and tried to look like she belonged, though she felt increasingly like an actress who'd forgotten her lines. "Aunt Aida!" Sophia's voice carried across the patio, bright with the kind of forced enthusiasm that immediately put Aida on alert. Her niece approached with 2 other girls in tow, all of them radiating the nervous energy of teenagers performing adulthood. "Everyone, this is my aunt," Sophia said, her voice carrying careful modulation. "Aida, these are my friends Madison and Chloe." "Not my Aunt Aida, just my aunt," as if her name wasn't quite suitable for this setting. The distinction stung more than it should have. Madison and Chloe offered polite smiles and murmured greetings, but Aida could see them cataloging details. Her department store dress, her sensible shoes, the way she held herself like someone unaccustomed to leisure. They were nice enough girls, probably, but their privilege was so complete they couldn't recognize it as such. "Sophia was just telling us about UCLA," Chloe said brightly. "So exciting. Are you looking forward to move-in day?" "Oh, absolutely," Sophia replied, though Aida caught the slight tremor in her voice. "Though the logistics are a bit complicated. You know how these things are." Aida frowned. "Logistics? What logistics?" They planned everything months ago. Aida would drive the moving truck, help Sophia settle into her dorm, maybe take her to dinner before heading home. It wasn't complicated at all. "Well, I'm sure you'll figure it out," Madison said, with the casual confidence of someone whose parents handled such details. "My parents are hiring a service to handle my move to Princeton. So much easier than dealing with all that yourself." "That sounds wonderful," Sophia said, and Aida heard something new in her niece's voice, a careful distance from her own reality. "Different families handle things differently, I guess." The words landed like a small slap. Different families. As if Aida's hands-on approach was somehow inadequate compared to hiring professionals. "Madison's family has used the same moving service for years," Chloe added helpfully. "They handle everything: packing, transportation, setup. Worth every penny." "I'm sure it is," Sophia said, and Aida caught her niece glancing around as if checking who might be listening. "Though we're more of a DIY family. DIY. Do it yourself." As if necessity was a choice, as if Aida's willingness to rent a truck and spend 2 days helping her niece move was some kind of quirky preference, rather than the only option they could afford. Aida felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was how Sophia saw their family, as the do-it-yourself option, the budget version of support that required apologies and careful explanations. "That's so sweet," Madison said, though her tone suggested she found it more quaint than sweet. Like really hands-on family bonding. Family bonding. As if Aida's sacrifices were a lifestyle choice, a way of building character rather than the simple reality of not having money to hire strangers to handle what family should do. The conversation moved on to other topics. Summer plans, college roommates, study abroad programs that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Aida stood at the edge of the group, increasingly aware that she was witnessing her niece's careful performance of belonging to a world that required constant apologizing for where she came from. As the evening wore on, Aida found herself relegated to conversations with other adults who seemed to view her as either inspiration or curiosity. The parents were unfailingly polite, but their kindness carried the patronizing quality of people congratulating someone for successfully completing a task they considered beneath them. She watched Sophia move through the party with growing unease. Her niece had learned to laugh at jokes that weren't quite funny, to agree with opinions that seemed designed to test her social awareness, to minimize any reference to her actual life in favor of the aspirational version she was trying to construct. And through it all, Aida realized with growing clarity that she had become an embarrassment, a reminder of the world Sophia was trying so hard to leave behind. Every mention of the diner, every reference to their modest circumstances, every indication that Sophia's support system operated on a different economic level than her friends seemed to make her niece shrink slightly. The recognition hurt more than any direct insult could have. After 3 years of sacrifice, of choosing Sophia's future over her own comfort, Aida had become something her niece needed to explain away, rather than celebrate. The stage was being set for something Aida couldn't yet see clearly, but she could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. In this world of casual wealth and assumed privilege, she was an anomaly that didn't quite fit, and increasingly, it seemed that Sophia agreed. The announcement came during dessert, when the catered chocolate fountains and artisanal petit fours had been wheeled out like props in an elaborate performance. Elena tapped her champagne flute with a silver spoon, the crystal chime cutting through the evening's conversation and drawing all attention to the poolside gathering area. "Everyone! Everyone!" Elena's voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I want to make a special announcement about our amazing graduates." Aida found herself swept along with the crowd toward the pool area, where Elena had positioned herself near a small platform that had been decorated with balloons and fairy lights. The setting was magazine perfect, designed for the kind of moment that would generate dozens of social media posts. "As you all know," Elena continued, her voice bright with genuine affection, "tonight we're celebrating some incredible achievements, and I couldn't be more proud to announce that my best friend Sophia Martinez has been accepted to UCLA." Applause erupted around the pool, and Aida felt a surge of pride despite her earlier discomfort. This was Sophia's moment, the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. Her niece stepped forward, radiant in the attention, accepting congratulations with the grace of someone born to such celebrations. "Speech! Speech!" Someone called out, and others picked up the chant until Sophia had no choice but to accept the microphone Elena thrust into her hands. "Thank you," Sophia began, her voice carrying across the water with practiced confidence. "I honestly can't believe this is real. UCLA has been my dream school since I was 15, and to actually be going there in the fall." She paused, allowing the crowd's enthusiasm to wash over her. "I couldn't have done it without the support of so many amazing people." Aida waited for the acknowledgement, for some recognition of the sacrifices that had made this moment possible. But Sophia's gratitude seemed carefully calibrated to her audience. "My mom has been incredible, working so hard to support my education. My friends have been there through every stressed-out study session and college application breakdown. And Elena's family has been like a second home to me, showing me what's possible when you dream big." The applause was warm, appreciative. Aida clapped along, but something cold was forming in her chest. No mention of the diner shifts, the overtime hours, the retirement savings that had been emptied dollar by dollar to make this dream achievable. "Now tell them about the scholarship," Elena called out, clearly excited to share more good news. "Sophia got partial academic funding, which is amazing." "It's true," Sophia said, her smile bright but somehow strained. "UCLA offered me a partial academic scholarship, which covers about 60% of tuition." "That's incredible," Madison shouted from the crowd. "What about the rest? Are your parents handling that, or did you get additional aid?" The question hung in the evening air like a challenge. Aida saw Sophia's micro-hesitation, the way her eyes darted briefly toward her mother and aunt before returning to her audience. The girl was trapped between honesty and image management, and Aida watched with growing unease as Sophia chose her path. "Well, you know how these things work," Sophia said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "College financing is so complicated. There are lots of different funding sources and family contributions and—" She waved her hand vaguely, as if the details were too mundane to discuss. "But your family's covering the gap, right?" This from Chloe, whose own parents had probably written a check for her full Princeton tuition without blinking. "I mean, 40% of UCLA tuition is still significant." Aida felt Carmen tense beside her. They both knew exactly what 40% of UCLA tuition meant, nearly $20,000 per year that someone had to provide. Someone who'd been working double shifts and eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner to make it possible. "Actually," Elena interjected with the enthusiasm of someone sharing exciting news, "I think it's so cool how Sophia's family handles education funding. It's like really grassroots and community-focused." "What do you mean?" Janet Chen asked, wineglass in hand and expression politely curious. "Well," Elena continued, apparently oblivious to the minefield she was wandering into, "Sophia's aunt works at a diner and has been saving up for Sophia's college fund for years. It's like this really beautiful family sacrifice story." The words hit the gathering like a record scratch. Aida felt dozens of eyes turned toward her, some curious, some pitying, all suddenly understanding exactly what kind of family dynamics they were witnessing. The elegant evening had just been interrupted by the reality of working-class struggle. "How wonderful," Elena Vasquez said quickly, clearly trying to smooth over the social awkwardness. "Family support comes in so many different forms." But the damage was done. Aida could see it in the subtle shift of expressions, the way conversations that had included her peripherally now seemed to close around her. She was no longer just Sophia's aunt. She was the diner worker who'd been funding the party girl's education, a walking reminder that not everyone here belonged to the same economic ecosystem. "That's really something," David Chen said, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying to be kind to someone he considered unfortunate. "The service industry doesn't exactly offer the kind of salary that makes college savings easy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "No," Aida said quietly, finding her voice for the first time since Elena's announcement. "It doesn't." The simple acknowledgement seemed to make everyone uncomfortable. These people were accustomed to college funding that came from stock portfolios and trust funds, not from skipped meals and postponed dreams. "But that's what makes it so meaningful," Elena continued, still apparently unaware of the social discomfort she'd created. "Like, Sophia's education is this real family investment. Everyone's contributing to make her dreams possible." "Elena?" Sophia said, her voice carrying a warning that only Aida seemed to catch. "I mean, it's just so authentic." Elena pressed on, her privilege allowing her to romanticize what she couldn't understand. "Like a real community effort. Your aunt must be so proud to be making such a difference." Aida felt the attention settle on her again, and this time she recognized it for what it was, the polite fascination of people observing someone they considered both admirable and pitiable. She was the noble poor relative, sacrificing for family, worthy of praise but not quite worthy of inclusion. "I am proud," Aida said carefully. Sophia's worked very hard. See? Elena beamed. It's like this whole family success story. And now Sophia gets to go to UCLA and pursue her dreams because everyone came together to make it possible. The way Elena told it, Aida's sacrifices sounded like a heartwarming community project, rather than the grinding reality of a woman who'd given up her own future for someone else's dream. The audience nodded appreciatively, as if they were witnessing something both touching and safely distant from their own experience. What field are you planning to study? Janet Chen asked Sophia, clearly trying to move the conversation toward more comfortable territory. Pre-med, Sophia replied, her confidence returning as they moved away from financial discussions. I want to be a pediatric surgeon. How ambitious, Miranda exclaimed. Medical school is expensive, though. Have you thought about how you'll handle that additional cost? Aida watched Sophia's face carefully, waiting to see how her niece would handle this next challenge. Would she acknowledge the reality of their situation, or would she continue the careful performance of belonging? Well, Sophia said slowly, that's still several years away. A lot can change. Of course, David said, but it's good to plan ahead. Medical school can cost upward of $300,000 these days. $300,000. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Aida felt her chest tighten as she realized what everyone was thinking, that her diner savings account would barely make a dent in that kind of debt. Sophia's very resourceful, Aida said quietly. She'll figure it out. Oh, I'm sure she will, Madison said brightly. And hey, maybe by then you'll be able to help with medical school too. That would be so generous. The casual assumption that Aida would continue funding Sophia's education indefinitely hit like a physical blow. These people saw her as an endless resource, a working-class aunt whose purpose was to facilitate her niece's upward mobility. Actually, Sophia said suddenly, her voice sharp with something Aida couldn't identify, I think we should probably not discuss my family's financial situation in such detail. None of them were destroying their family's future with electronic transfers and notarized signatures. The cashier's check will be made out to you personally, Janet confirmed as she handed Aida the paperwork. $47,832.15. The check felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of lead rather than paper. Aida folded it carefully and placed it in her purse, next to her phone which had been buzzing constantly since she'd turned it back on. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Janet asked, though her tone suggested she hoped the answer was no. That's everything, Aida said, and meant it in ways Janet couldn't understand. Back in her car, Aida finally looked at her phone. 17 missed calls from Carmen, 12 from an unknown number that was probably Sophia, and 3 voicemails she deleted without listening to. Whatever they had to say, she didn't want to hear it. Not yet. She drove to Sunset Memorial Park, where Michael had been buried 3 years ago in a plot she'd helped pay for. The cemetery was quiet on Sunday morning, populated only by groundskeepers and the occasional visitor placing fresh flowers. Aida hadn't been back since the funeral. She'd told herself she was too busy, too focused on keeping her promises to waste time talking to graves. Michael's headstone was simple granite, with his name, dates, and the inscription, Beloved Father and Brother. No mention of his debts, his failed business ventures, or the financial chaos he'd left behind. Death had a way of editing out the inconvenient truths. I kept my promise, Aida said aloud, feeling foolish but needing to hear the words spoken. Sophia's college fund. $47,000. Just like I said. The grave offered no response, which was probably appropriate. Michael had never been good with gratitude when he was alive. No reason to expect it now. But she called me embarrassing, Mickey. Your daughter, the one I've been killing myself to support. Aida's voice cracked on the words. 3 years of working doubles and eating peanut butter sandwiches, and I'm embarrassing. A groundskeeper passed with a riding mower, giving her the kind of wide berth reserved for grieving relatives. Aida wondered what he saw, a middle-aged woman talking to a headstone or someone having a breakdown in public. Maybe both. You always said I was too generous. she continued, her voice stronger now. Remember? Every time you needed money for some scheme or business idea, you'd say, Aida's got a soft heart and deep pockets. Well, guess what? The pockets are empty now. The cashier's check crinkled in her purse as she shifted position, and Aida found herself laughing. A bitter sound that probably looked like sobbing from a distance. $47,000, Mickey. Do you know what I could do with that money? I could travel. I could fix my car. I could go on a real date with Frank Torres instead of grabbing coffee between my shifts. She paused, considering. I could retire before I'm 70 and actually enjoy a few years of my life. The possibility felt foreign, almost ridiculous. Aida Miller? Living for herself? Spending money on her own dreams instead of funding someone else's future? The concept was so alien she could barely hold it in her mind. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she looked. A text from Carmen. Sophia wants to apologize. She was nervous and said something stupid. Please don't do anything you'll regret. Regret. As if the last 3 years hadn't been one long exercise in regret management. As if choosing Sophia's future over her own happiness hadn't been the kind of decision that required constant justification to make bearable. Another text, this one from the unknown number. Aunt Aida, it's Sophia. It's kind of personal. The rebuke was directed at the group, but Aida felt it land on her. Sophia was embarrassed, not by the questions, but by having to acknowledge the source of her funding in front of her wealthy friends. Of course, Elena said quickly. I didn't mean to pry. I just think it's beautiful how supportive your family is. It is beautiful, Sophia said, but her tone suggested she found it anything but. But maybe we could talk about something else? The dismissal stung. After 3 years of sacrifice, Aida had become something that required deflection rather than celebration. She watched her niece skillfully redirect the conversation towards safer topics, but the damage was done. Excuse me, Aida said quietly, stepping away from the group. She needed air, needed space, needed distance from the polite humiliation of being treated like a charity case by people who'd never worked a day in food service. But as she moved toward the edge of the gathering, she heard Elena's voice again, this time pitched lower but still carrying across the space. I'm sorry if I said something wrong, Elena was saying to Sophia. I didn't realize discussing your aunt was uncomfortable. It's not uncomfortable, Sophia replied, but Aida could hear the lie in her voice. It's just, she's a little embarrassing sometimes. She doesn't really understand how these kinds of conversations work. Embarrassing. The word hit Aida like a physical blow, stopping her mid-step. She turned back toward the group, certain she'd misheard, but Sophia was still talking. She means well, but she's not really used to this. Sophia gestured vaguely at the elegant surroundings. Sometimes she says things or acts in ways that are just, embarrassing. The casual cruelty of it took Aida's breath away. 3 years of sacrifice, of choosing Sophia's future over her own comfort. And she had become embarrassing. A working-class embarrassment who didn't know how to navigate conversations about money because she'd never had enough of it to be casual about discussing it. Around the pool, heads nodded with understanding. Of course, Sophia was embarrassed by her aunt. The woman was clearly out of her depth, didn't understand the social dynamics of wealth, couldn't participate in conversations about college funding without making everyone uncomfortable with the reality of her situation. Aida stood frozen, watching her niece accept the group's sympathy for having to deal with such an embarrassing relative. The girl she'd sacrificed everything for was apologizing for her existence to people who would never understand what that sacrifice had cost. The evening air suddenly felt cold against her skin, and Aida realized that something fundamental had just shattered. Not just her relationship with Sophia, but her understanding of what the last 3 years had meant. She hadn't been building her niece's future. She'd been paying for the privilege of being tolerated, of being included just enough to continue funding someone else's dreams. Carmen appeared at her elbow, face pale with understanding. Aida, she whispered. She didn't mean. Yes, Aida said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her chest. She did. Without another word, Aida Miller turned and walked away from the party, leaving behind the sound of polite laughter and the girl who just taught her that some kinds of love weren't worth the cost of dignity. Aida's hands shook as she fumbled with her car keys in the valet circle, the word embarrassing echoing in her skull like a curse she couldn't escape. The young valet approached with professional concern, probably wondering why the woman in the department store dress was standing frozen beside her Honda while tears ran down her cheeks. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle in the way that suggested he'd witnessed family drama before at these kinds of events. "Fine," Aida managed, though the word came out broken. "Just fine." She drove without direction at first, letting muscle memory guide her through the winding streets of Ridgeview Heights, while her mind replayed Sophia's casual cruelty. "She's a little embarrassing sometimes." 3 years of sacrifice, reduced to a social inconvenience. 3 years of choosing her niece's future over her own comfort, and she had become something to apologize for. The anger built slowly, starting as a cold knot in her stomach and spreading outward until her entire body vibrated with rage. By the time she reached the main road, Aida's hands had stopped shaking, and her vision had narrowed to a single, crystalline focus. She pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank, knowing it would be closed but needing to see the building where her decisions had been made real. The ATM glowed in the darkness like a shrine to financial transaction, and Aida sat in her car staring at it while her phone buzzed with increasingly frantic texts. "Carmen, where did you go? Sophia is looking for you." "Carmen, Aida, please answer." She didn't mean what she said. "Carmen, people are asking where you went. This is embarrassing." Embarrassing. Even Carmen was using that word now, as if Aida's hurt feelings were the real social problem, rather than Sophia's casual cruelty. Aida turned off her phone without reading the rest. The ATM accepted her card with mechanical indifference. Account balance, $47,832. 15. 3 years and 2 months of overtime shifts, skipped meals, and deferred dreams translated into numbers on a screen. She stared at the figure until her eyes burned, then drove home to her small apartment where she spent the night sitting in her kitchen chair, watching the clock and waiting for morning. Sleep never came. Instead, Aida found herself calculating, not just the money she'd saved, but the cost of saving it. The vacation to Europe she'd canceled when Sophia needed SAT prep courses. The dental work she'd postponed when application fees came due. The dinner dates with Frank she'd turned down because overtime shifts paid time and a half. She'd been disappearing piece by piece for 3 years, Frank had said. Now she understood that the disappearance was complete. The woman who'd existed before Michael's death. The woman who'd had dreams of her own, who'd thought about retirement and travel and maybe even love. That woman was gone. In her place sat someone whose entire identity had been reduced to being Sophia's embarrassing aunt. At 9 a.m. sharp, Aida was waiting outside First National when the manager unlocked the doors. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller." Janet Rodriguez, the branch manager, greeted her with professional warmth. "You're here early today." "I need to close the joint account," Aida said without preamble. "Transfer everything to my personal checking, then get a cashier's check for the full amount." Janet's expression flickered with concern. The Sophia Martinez Education Fund had been Aida's pride for 3 years. She'd come in monthly to make deposits, watching the balance grow with the satisfaction of someone building something meaningful. "Of course," Janet said carefully. "May I ask if there's a problem with the account structure?" "No problem," Aida replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. "I just want to consolidate my funds." The transaction took 47 minutes. Aida sat in the small conference room while Janet processed the paperwork, watching through the glass walls as other customers conducted normal banking business. A young mother deposited a birthday check. An elderly man discussed CD rates. "I'm sorry about last night. I didn't mean what I said. Can we talk?" Aida stared at the message, waiting to feel something other than anger. Some softening, some recognition of the love that had motivated 3 years of sacrifice. But all she felt was the cold satisfaction of finally having power in a relationship that had rendered her powerless. She typed back, "Which part didn't you mean?" The part where you called me embarrassing, or the part where you acted like my support was something to apologize for? The response came immediately. All of it. I was nervous and trying to fit in. You know how important these friendships are for my future. Aida read the message twice, waiting for an acknowledgement that never came. No recognition of what her sacrifice had cost. No understanding that 3 years of her life had been traded for Sophia's comfort. Just an explanation that positioned Aida's hurt feelings as an obstacle to her niece's social advancement. She turned off the phone and drove to Miller's diner. The Sunday afternoon crowd was thin, a few regulars nursing coffee and the occasional family stopping for late breakfast. Frank looked up from the grill when she walked in, his face creasing with concern. "Aida, what are you doing here? Thought you were at the party." "Party's over," she said simply, taking her usual position behind the counter. "Mind if I work? Need to keep my hands busy." Frank studied her face, clearly reading the signs of someone barely holding it together. What happened? Nothing that shouldn't have happened years ago. She began wiping down surfaces that were already clean, her movements sharp and efficient. The familiar rhythm of restaurant work helped quiet the storm in her head but couldn't eliminate it entirely. "You want to talk about it?" Frank asked, moving closer. "Not yet." Aida paused in her cleaning. "Frank, you ever regret helping people?" "Every day," he said without hesitation. "Doesn't mean I stopped doing it." "Maybe you should. Maybe we both should." The words hung between them like a challenge. Frank had spent months encouraging Aida to prioritize herself, to recognize that her generosity had become self-destruction. Now she was finally listening, and the victory felt hollow. "Aida," he said carefully, "whatever happened at that party, whatever someone said or did, don't make any big decisions while you're this angry." But the decision was already made. Had been made the moment Sophia chose social acceptance over family loyalty. The moment Aida realized she'd been funding her own humiliation for 3 years. "Too late," she said, patting her purse where the cashier's check waited like a loaded weapon. "Already done." Frank's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The college fund." "All of it?" Aida met his gaze steadily. $47,832.15. Enough to change someone's life, Frank. Question is, whose life is it going to change? Jesus, Aida, you can't. Can't what? Can't take my own money? Can't decide I'm worth more than being called embarrassing by someone I've been supporting for 3 years? Her voice rose, drawing glances from the few customers. Can't finally put myself first for once in my goddamn life? Frank stepped back, recognizing the futility of reasoning with someone who'd reached their breaking point. Aida saw understanding in his eyes. Not approval, exactly, but recognition that this moment had been building for months. Her phone buzzed again, and Aida glanced at the screen. Carmen, calling for the 8th time. Soon they would figure out that something was really wrong. Soon they would check the account and discover what she'd done. Soon the consequences would begin. But for now, in this moment between action and aftermath, Aida Miller felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. The intoxicating power of choosing herself. It wouldn't last. She already knew that. The guilt would come along with the practical complications and family drama. But right now, wiping down counters in the diner, where she'd worked countless extra shifts to fund someone else's dreams, Aida allowed herself to imagine a different future. One where her money served her own goals. Where her sacrifices were acknowledged rather than dismissed. Where love didn't require the complete erasure of self. The cashier's check in her purse represented more than money. It was 3 years of her life reclaimed, 3 years of dignity restored. Whether that would be enough to justify what came next remained to be seen. But for the first time since Michael's funeral, Aida Miller was betting on herself. Monday morning arrived with the mechanical indifference of any other workday, but Carmen Martinez knew within 30 seconds that her world had fundamentally shifted. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, coffee growing cold beside her, staring at the error message that made no sense. Payment declined. Insufficient funds. Carmen refreshed the UCLA enrollment portal and tried again, certain there had been some technical glitch. The tuition deposit was only $500, a fraction of what should have been in Sophia's college fund. The account had contained nearly $48,000 on Friday. There was no possible way it could be empty. The third attempt yielded the same result: insufficient funds. With trembling fingers, Carmen navigated to the bank's website and logged into the joint account she'd set up with Aida 3 years ago. The account they'd both contributed to, though Aida's contributions had dwarfed her own modest additions. Account balance: $0. Last transaction: Sunday, 9:47 a.m. Complete withdrawal of $47, $832.15. Carmen stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Aida had taken everything. Every dollar that had been saved for Sophia's future, gone in a single transaction. "Mom?" Sophia's voice drifted down from upstairs. "Did you pay the deposit yet?" Carmen closed the laptop with shaking hands, her phone already buzzing with notifications as she began calling Aida's number. The calls went straight to voicemail, and with each ignored ring, the magnitude of the disaster became clearer. Her daughter's future had vanished overnight, and the woman who'd promised to secure it was nowhere to be found. Rosa Miller had survived the Great Depression, 2 wars, and raising 2 children as a single mother after her husband died young. At 82, she possessed the kind of steely pragmatism that comes from decades of making hard decisions with limited resources. When Carmen Martinez called her Tuesday morning, sobbing incoherently about empty bank accounts and missing money, Rosa's response was swift and decisive. "Stop crying and speak clearly," Rosa said in accented English that still carried traces of her childhood in El Salvador. "What exactly has happened?" Through Carmen's broken explanation, Rosa pieced together the disaster. Aida had withdrawn Sophia's entire college fund. The girl's future was in jeopardy. The family was fracturing along lines that had been weakening for 3 years. "Where is Aida now?" Rosa asked. "She won't answer her phone. She won't talk to us. I don't know what to do." Rosa knew exactly what to do. She'd been watching this crisis build for months, seeing the signs that her daughter was reaching a breaking point that no one else wanted to acknowledge. Aida had been disappearing piece by piece, sacrificing herself on the altar of family obligation until nothing remained but resentment and exhaustion. "Bring Sophia to my apartment at 2 o'clock, Rosa commanded, "and call Aida. Tell her I want to see her at the same time." "What if she won't come?" "She'll come," Rosa said with certainty. "Aida has never disobeyed me in 60 years. She's not starting now." Rosa's apartment in the Sunset District was a shrine to careful living. Every piece of furniture had been chosen for function over form. Every decorative item earned its place through sentiment or utility. The walls held photographs spanning 6 decades. Michael and Aida as children, school graduations, family gatherings that documented the gradual expansion and contraction of their small clan. At exactly 2 o'clock, Aida knocked on the door. Rosa opened it to find her daughter looking like she hadn't slept in days, her usual composure replaced by something brittle and dangerous. "Mama," Aida said quietly, stepping into the familiar space that smelled of café con leche and the lemon oil Rosa used on her wooden surfaces. "Sit," Rosa commanded, gesturing toward the kitchen table where she'd conducted family meetings for decades. "We wait for the others." Carmen and Sophia arrived 10 minutes later, both red-eyed and tense. Sophia had clearly been crying. Her careful makeup was smudged, and she kept glancing at Aida with a mixture of guilt and resentment that made Rosa's chest tighten with recognition. "Now," Rosa said once everyone was seated around her small table, "someone will explain to me how this family has destroyed itself in 3 days." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Sophia finally spoke. "Tia Aida took my college money. All of it." "I took my money," Aida corrected sharply. "Money I earned working double shifts for 3 years while you played at being a rich girl. That money was for Sophia's education." Carmen interjected, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "You promised Michael." "Michael is dead," Aida said flatly. He's been dead for 3 years, but apparently I'm the only one who's noticed. Rosa studied her daughter's face, seeing decades of accumulated grievance finally breaking through the surface. Aida, explain what happened at this party. Aida's laugh was bitter. Your granddaughter called me embarrassing in front of her wealthy friends, said I didn't understand how these kinds of conversations work, apologized for my existence to people who wouldn't piss on me if I was on fire. Sophia? Rosa's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to extracting truth. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, Sophia said defensively. I was nervous, and Elena was asking all these questions about money, and You were ashamed of me, Aida said quietly. Ashamed of the woman who's been funding your dreams for 3 years. That's not true. Then explain why you introduced me as my aunt who helps out, instead of my aunt who's paying for my education. Explain why you deflected every mention of my sacrifice. Explain why you acted like my support was something to apologize for. Sophia's face crumpled, but Rosa wasn't ready to let her off the hook. What exactly did you say, Mija? I said she was embarrassing sometimes, Sophia whispered. That she doesn't understand how these conversations work, that she's not used to. She gestured helplessly. To that kind of environment. And what kind of environment is that? Rosa asked. You know, wealthy people, educated families, people who don't have to worry about money. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Rosa felt something cold settle in her chest as she recognized the ugly truth. Her granddaughter had internalized shame about her own family, had learned to see their financial struggles as character flaws rather than circumstances. Carmen, Rosa said quietly, tell me about Michael's promises. Carmen's face went pale. What do you mean? Tell me what he promised Sophia about college. The truth. Mama, I don't think. Aida started. The truth, Rosa repeated, her voice carrying the weight of 8 decades. Carmen's shoulders sagged in defeat. He told her the money was already saved, that she didn't need to worry about college costs because everything was taken care of. But there was no money, Rosa said. It wasn't a question. No, Michael had debts. The restaurant failed, and he'd been borrowing against everything. The house, his car, even Sophia's savings account from when she was little. Carmen's voice broke. When he died, there was nothing left. Less than nothing. So Aida made good on a lie, Rosa said, the pieces finally clicking into place. I had to, Aida said defensively. Sophia was 17 years old and had been promised a college education. How could I tell her that her father had lied, that everything she'd planned for was built on nothing? The same way you tell anyone hard truths, Rosa said sharply, with honesty and love. Instead, you decided to sacrifice yourself to maintain a dead man's lie. He was my brother. He was my son, Rosa said, her voice rising. And I loved him desperately. But Michael was irresponsible with money from the time he could walk. You bailed him out of every financial crisis he ever had, and when he died, you decided to keep doing it. Aida flinched as if she'd been slapped. Someone had to take care of his family. His family includes you, Aida. You are family too. But somehow you decided that your job was to disappear so everyone else could have what they wanted. That's what family does, Aida said, but her voice lacked conviction. No, Rosa said firmly. That's what martyrs do. Family supports each other without erasing themselves. She turned to Sophia, who had been sitting in stunned silence as the adult conversation revealed truths she'd never suspected. Did you know your father left debts? No, Sophia whispered. Did you know Aida emptied her retirement savings to fund your college account? No, I thought she was just contributing. Like, adding to what was already there. There was nothing already there, Mija. Every dollar in that account came from your aunt working overtime shifts and eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. Sophia's face went white. I didn't know. Because no one told you, Rosa said. Because the adults in your life decided it was better to let you live in ignorance than deal with the messy reality of your situation. We were trying to protect her, Carmen said weakly. From what? From understanding that money has to come from somewhere? from appreciating what Aida was giving up for her. Rosa's voice carried decades of frustration. You protected her from reality, and now look where we are. She stood and moved to her kitchen counter, where she kept a metal box full of old photographs and documents. She returned with a faded manila folder that she placed on the table. These are the records from Michael's funeral expenses, she said. Aida paid for everything. The casket, the burial plot, the reception afterward. $7,000 she didn't have, charged to credit cards she's still paying off. Carmen stared at the receipts in shock. I didn't know. Because Aida didn't tell you, just like she didn't tell you about the overtime shifts or the skipped meals, or the fact that she hasn't bought herself clothes in 2 years. Rosa's voice was steady but ruthless. She's been erasing herself piece by piece, and you've all been so comfortable with it that you never asked what it was costing her. I offered to help, Carmen said defensively. I tried to contribute to the college fund. $50 a month, Rosa said flatly. When the account needed $20,000 a year, you made token contributions to feel better about accepting Aida's sacrifice. The harsh assessment made Carmen flinch, but Rosa wasn't finished. And you, Sophia, you've been living like a wealthy girl on your aunt's dime, developing friendships with people who make you ashamed of where you come from. Did you ever ask Aida what she was giving up for you? I thought she wanted to help, Sophia said, tears streaming down her face. She did want to help. That's the tragedy. She wanted to help so much that she forgot she mattered too. Rosa's voice softened slightly. Your aunt has spent 3 years working herself to death to keep a promise to a dead man, and instead of recognizing the gift, you called her embarrassing. I didn't mean it. You meant it enough to say it in front of strangers. You meant it enough to apologize for her existence to people who will never understand what she's given up for you. The room fell silent except for Sophia's quiet sobbing. Rosa looked at each of them in turn. Her daughter, rigid with justification and hurt. Her daughter-in-law crumbling under the weight of revealed truths. Her granddaughter finally confronting the cost of her comfortable ignorance. This family has a sickness, Rosa said finally. We confuse love with sacrifice, support with erasure. We enable each other's worst impulses and call it loyalty. She turned to Aida. You enabled Michael's irresponsibility for 30 years, and when he died, you decided to keep enabling it by maintaining his lies. Then to Carmen. You accepted Aida's sacrifice without question because it was easier than facing your own financial limitations. Finally to Sophia. And you lived off someone else's generosity while developing shame about the source of your support. So what do we do now? Carmen asked quietly. Now, Rosa said, we tell the truth, all of it. No more protecting anyone from reality. No more martyrdom disguised as love. We figure out how to be a family without requiring Aida to disappear. She looked directly at her daughter. That means you get to keep some of that money for yourself, Aida. You've earned the right to think about your own future. Then to Sophia. And you get to learn what it means to work for something you want instead of having it handed to you. Finally to Carmen. And you get to stop accepting charity and start building real solutions. But what about UCLA? Sophia asked, panic creeping into her voice. What about it? Rosa replied. If you want it badly enough, you'll find a way to make it happen without requiring your aunt to sacrifice her entire life. There are student loans, part-time jobs, community college transfers. Your father's lies don't entitle you to someone else's retirement. The harsh reality settled over the room like a weight. For 3 years, they'd all been living in a fantasy where love meant endless sacrifice and family obligation trumped individual needs. Now, in Rosa's small kitchen, that fantasy was crumbling into pieces they'd have to reassemble into something more honest. Whether they could build something better from the wreckage remained to be seen. But for the first time in 3 years, they were at least dealing with the truth. Wednesday dawned gray and overcast. The kind of California morning that felt like the sky was holding its breath. Aida Miller sat in her kitchen chair for the 3rd consecutive morning, staring at the cashier's check that had become both weapon and shield. The numbers hadn't changed. $47. 832. 15. But their meaning continued to shift like sand beneath her feet. Rosa's words from the previous day echoed in the small apartment. You enabled Michael's irresponsibility for 30 years, and when he died, you decided to keep enabling it by maintaining his lies. The accusation stung because it carried the sharp edge of truth. Aida had always been Michael's safety net, catching him every time his charm couldn't cover his latest financial disaster. She dressed carefully in her most conservative outfit, the same navy dress she'd worn to the graduation party, now feeling like armor against a world that had revealed its true opinion of her. The drive to Sunset Memorial Park felt longer than it should have, each mile weighted with 3 years of unexamined grief. Michael's grave looked smaller than she remembered. The granite headstone had weathered slightly, and someone, probably Carmen, had left fresh flowers that were already beginning to wilt in the morning heat. Aida stood at the foot of the plot, hands clenched around the handle of her purse, finally ready to have the conversation she'd been avoiding. I'm angry at you, she said aloud, her voice steady in the cemetery silence. I've been angry for 3 years, but I convinced myself it was grief. A groundskeeper worked in the distance, the sound of his mower creating a buffer of white noise that made the conversation feel private despite the public setting. You left her with nothing, Mickey. Worse than nothing, you left her with the expectation that everything was taken care of. Aida's voice grew stronger, 3 years of suppressed resentment finally finding expression. Do you know what it cost me to make good on your lies? Not just the money. The time, the energy. The pieces of myself I gave up to fix your mistakes one last time. The groundskeeper moved closer, and Aida lowered her voice, suddenly self-conscious about arguing with a dead man in public. I told myself I was doing it for Sophia, but that's not true, is it? I was doing it for you. Still taking care of little Mickey's problems, still making sure he didn't look bad in front of his family. Her laugh was bitter. Even dead, you managed to make me responsible for your messes. A memory surfaced unbidden. Michael at 25, standing in her apartment with that familiar combination of sheepishness and charm, explaining how he'd borrowed against his car to invest in a friend's restaurant that had already failed. Just this once, Aid. I'll pay you back with interest, I promise. She'd given him the money, of course. She always did. 35 years of cleaning up after you? Aida continued, her voice breaking. 35 years of believing that's what big sisters do. And when you died, I thought the only way to honor you was to keep doing it forever. Tears came suddenly. 3 years of grief and anger and exhaustion combining into something that felt like breaking apart and coming together simultaneously. Aida sank onto the small granite bench beside the grave, no longer caring if the groundskeeper thought she was having a breakdown. But Sophia called me embarrassing, Mickey. Your daughter, the one I've been sacrificing everything for, is ashamed of me. And maybe that's fair. Maybe I am embarrassing. A 60-year-old woman who doesn't know the difference between love and martyrdom. The groundskeeper had moved on to another section, leaving Aida alone with her brother's silence and her own revelations. I kept telling myself you'd be proud of what I was doing for her. But you know what? You'd probably just expect it. You'd take it for granted the same way you took everything else for granted. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm done, Mickey. I'm done fixing your mistakes and paying for your promises. Sophia's gonna have to figure out her own way forward. 15 miles away, Sophia Martinez sat at her laptop in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the detritus of a future that was rapidly dissolving. College brochures, acceptance letters, and course catalogs covered her desk like fragments of a broken dream. The UCLA enrollment portal glowed on her screen, cursor hovering over the request deferral button. She'd been staring at the same page for an hour, unable to make the click that would officially delay her college plans. The deadline for the tuition deposit had passed on Monday. Without it, her admission would be automatically canceled unless she could prove extenuating circumstances. Her phone buzzed with another text from Elena. My parents want to talk to you about something important. Can you come over today? Sophia closed the laptop without responding. She couldn't face Elena's family right now. couldn't stomach another encounter with people who saw her situation as either pitiable or fixable, with the kind of casual generosity that meant nothing to them and everything to her. The reality of her situation was finally crystallizing with brutal clarity. Even if she could convince UCLA to hold her spot, even if she could secure enough loans to cover tuition, she'd still need money for housing, food, books, and all the invisible costs that came with college life. The partial scholarship that had seemed so generous now felt inadequate, covering only a fraction of what she'd need. Carmen knocked softly on her bedroom door. "Mija?" Elena's mom called. "She wants to invite you to lunch to discuss something." Quote, "I can't," Sophia said without opening the door. "Not today." She said it was about college funding. The words made Sophia's stomach clench with humiliation. Word was spreading about her family's financial disaster, turning her from scholarship recipient to charity case in the span of a week. "I said no," Sophia repeated, louder this time. She heard Carmen's footsteps retreat down the hallway, followed by the soft closing of her mother's bedroom door. They were all in isolation now, processing the wreckage of Saturday night in their separate corners of grief and regret. Sophia opened her laptop again and navigated to the financial aid website, researching student loan options with the grim determination of someone learning to swim while drowning. The numbers were staggering. She could borrow enough to cover tuition and basic expenses, but would graduate with debt that would follow her for decades. A different search led her to community college transfer programs, and she found herself reading about pathways that would allow her to complete her first 2 years locally before transferring to UCLA. The timeline would be delayed, the prestige diminished, but the financial reality was undeniable. Her phone rang, and Elena's name appeared on the screen. Sophia let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message despite herself. "Soph, I know you're upset, but my parents really want to help. They feel terrible about what happened at the party. They think they contributed to the whole situation by asking those questions about money. Please call me back. We can figure this out together." The offer of help should have felt like salvation, but instead it felt like salt in an open wound. Elena's parents wanted to fix Sophia's problems the way they might tip an extra generous amount to a struggling server, a gesture that was kind but fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the problem. Sophia deleted the voicemail and returned to her laptop research. State school transfer rates, loan forgiveness programs, work-study options, all the practical realities that her wealthy friends never had to consider. For the first time in her life, she was truly understanding what her aunt had been navigating for 3 years. The recognition brought a fresh wave of guilt. While Aida had been calculating overtime shifts and skipping meals, Sophia had been complaining about having to take the SAT twice. While her aunt had been postponing dental work to save money, Sophia had been shopping with Elena and accepting expensive gifts without question. "I was embarrassing," she said aloud to her empty room, testing the words that had destroyed everything. She was embarrassing. But sitting in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by evidence of her collapsing future, Sophia began to understand who had really been embarrassing whom. Her aunt, working double shifts and eating peanut butter sandwiches, had been funding Sophia's performance of belonging to a world that would never truly accept either of them. Frank Torres found Aida in Miller's diner at 4 o'clock, mechanically wiping down tables that were already clean. She looked up when he entered, and he saw something in her face that made his chest tighten with recognition, the hollow expression of someone who'd finally stopped running from their own pain. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, settling onto a bar stool across from where she worked. "I went to see Michael today," Aida said without preamble. "First time since the funeral." Frank waited, understanding that some conversations required patience. "I told him I was done," she continued, her voice steady but fragile. "Done fixing his mistakes, done sacrificing myself to maintain his lies." It felt, she paused, searching for the right word. It felt like waking up from a 3-year coma. "That's good," Frank said carefully. "That's healthy." "Is it?" Aida's laugh was shaky. "Because it doesn't feel good. It feels like I've destroyed my family for the sake of my pride." Your family destroyed itself when they stopped seeing you as a person with needs of your own. The blunt assessment made Aida flinch, but she didn't argue. Maybe, but I took that money knowing it would devastate Sophia. Whatever she said, whatever she did, is my hurt worth destroying an 18-year-old's future? Frank studied her face, seeing the woman he'd fallen for struggling with the weight of her own actions. Can I tell you about my daughter? Aida nodded, grateful for any perspective that might help her navigate the moral complexity of her situation. When Sarah was 17, she got pregnant, Frank said quietly. Her mother and I were still married then, and Maria wanted me to support them financially while Sarah finished high school and raised the baby. That sounds reasonable. It was reasonable. It was also enabling behavior disguised as love. Sarah never learned to take responsibility for her choices because I was always there to catch her when she fell. Frank's voice carried old pain. She had 2 more kids by different fathers, never held a job for more than 6 months, never developed any skills beyond manipulating me into paying for her mistakes. Aida stopped wiping the counter, giving him her full attention. It took me 10 years to realize that my generosity was actually cruelty. By protecting her from consequences, I was keeping her from growing up. When I finally said no, when I stopped being her safety net, she hated me for it. How did it end? It took 3 years of me refusing to rescue her before she figured out how to rescue herself. 3 years of her calling me selfish and cruel, while she learned to pay her own bills and make her own decisions. Frank's smile was sad, but genuine. She's a nurse now, married to a good man, raising those kids in a stable home. But none of that would have happened if I'd kept enabling her. The parallel was obvious, and Aida felt something shift in her chest. Not absolution, exactly, but a different way of understanding her actions. You're saying I did the right thing. I'm saying you did the necessary thing. Whether it was right or wrong, that's not for me to judge. But sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone is stop rescuing them. Aida's phone buzzed with another missed call from Carmen, and she glanced at the screen without answering. They want me to give the money back, she said. Do you want to give it back? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Aida considered it honestly, examining her motivations and desires without the filter of family obligation. Part of it, she said finally. Not all of it. Not enough to let everyone go back to pretending this never happened. Frank nodded approvingly. That sounds like wisdom. Or selfishness. Maybe there's no difference, he said gently. Maybe after 60 years of putting everyone else first, a little selfishness is exactly what you need. Outside, the afternoon was giving way to evening, and the diner's familiar rhythms provided a backdrop for Aida's internal reckoning. She thought about Sophia, probably researching student loans and community college transfer programs, finally confronting the reality of her situation. She thought about Carmen, caught between loyalty to her daughter and gratitude to Aida. She thought about Rosa, whose brutal honesty had forced everyone to confront truths they'd been avoiding. Most of all, she thought about herself, not as Michael's sister or Sophia's aunt or Frank's potential girlfriend, but as Aida Miller, a woman with her own needs and dreams and right to dignity. The cashier's check in her purse still felt heavy with possibility and consequence. But for the first time since Saturday night, Aida could imagine a future where some of that money served her own goals rather than disappearing into someone else's needs. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, it wasn't resolution. But it was the beginning of something that might eventually become both. Friday arrived with the weight of accumulated silence. 7 days had passed since the graduation party, and the Miller family existed in a state of careful suspension, each member processing the wreckage in isolation while tentatively reaching towards some form of resolution. Aida Miller stood behind the counter at Miller's Diner, watching the morning regulars settle into their familiar routines, and wondered if her family would ever find their way back to anything resembling normal. The cashier's check still lived in her purse, though its presence had evolved from vindication to burden. Frank's daughter Sarah had visited on Thursday, sharing her story of reconciliation and hard-won wisdom about the difference between helping and enabling. Rosa had called twice, Each conversation a masterclass in brutal honesty, disguised as maternal concern. But it was Carmen's text that morning that had shifted something fundamental in Aida's chest. "Sophia wants to talk to you. She's been working on something all week. Would you be willing to meet her?" Not a demand for the money's return. Not accusations or ultimatums. Just a simple request that acknowledged Aida's right to refuse. Aida had agreed to meet at the diner during her afternoon break, neutral territory where they could speak honestly without the weight of family history pressing down on every word. Now, watching the lunch crowd thin out, she found herself dreading and anticipating the conversation in equal measure. Frank emerged from the kitchen at exactly 2 o'clock, wiping his hands on his apron and giving Aida the kind of look that suggested he'd been watching her internal struggle all morning. "You sure you want to do this here?" he asked quietly. "Could go somewhere more private." "No," Aida said, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "Here is good. Honest work, honest conversation." Frank nodded, understanding the symbolism. The diner represented Aida's reality, the place where she'd worked countless extra shifts to fund someone else's dreams. If Sophia wanted to rebuild their relationship, she needed to do it in the context of who Aida actually was, not who Sophia wished she could be. At 2:15, the door chimed with familiar authority, and Sophia Martinez walked into Miller's diner, looking like she'd aged years in a single week. Gone was the polished confidence of the graduation party. In its place stood a young woman who moved with the careful uncertainty of someone learning to navigate consequences for the first time. "Tia Aida," Sophia said, her voice carrying none of its usual assurance. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Aida gestured toward a corner booth, the same one where she'd eaten countless late dinners between shifts, too tired to cook at home. They sat across from each other like negotiators at a peace summit, both aware that the wrong word could shatter whatever fragile possibility existed between them. "You look tired," Aida observed, noting the shadows under Sophia's eyes and the way her usually perfect hair showed signs of being forgotten. "I haven't been sleeping much," Sophia admitted. "I've been thinking about what you said." "About what I said?" "About everything, really." Frank appeared with 2 cups of coffee without being asked, his presence a quiet reminder that Aida wasn't alone in this conversation. He retreated to the kitchen but remained within earshot, a protective gesture that wasn't lost on either woman. "I brought something," Sophia said, pulling a manila folder from her bag. "I wanted to show you what I've been working on." Aida accepted the folder with curiosity, opening it to reveal printed pages covered with numbers, spreadsheets, and research notes. At the top of the first page, in Sophia's careful handwriting, UCLA Alternative Financial Plan. "I've been researching every possible way to pay for college without relying on your money," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional weight of the words. "Student loans, work-study programs, community college transfer options, scholarship applications I missed the first time around." Aida scanned the documents, seeing months of careful planning compressed into a week of desperate research. Loan applications, employment possibilities, academic timelines that stretched Sophia's college experience from 4 years to 6, but reduced the financial burden significantly. "The UC system has a program where I can complete my first 2 years at the community college and transfer with guaranteed admission," Sophia continued. "It would delay my graduation, but the cost savings are enormous. I could work part-time, take out smaller loans, maybe even save enough to avoid borrowing for my final 2 years." The thoroughness of the research was impressive, but Aida found herself studying her niece's face more than the papers. This was a different Sophia than the girl who'd dismissed her as embarrassing. Someone who'd been forced to confront practical realities that had previously existed outside her awareness. "This represents a completely different timeline," Aida said carefully. "What about medical school? Your friends going off to universities while you're at community college?" Sophia's composure wavered slightly. "Medical school will still happen, just later. And my friends?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think I need to figure out who my real friends are." The ones who care about me regardless of where I go to school, or how much money my family has. The admission carried weight beyond its surface meaning. Sophia was acknowledging that her social circle had been built on performance rather than authentic connection, that her desperate need to fit in had contributed to the crisis that destroyed her college fund. Elena's parents offered to pay my tuition, Sophia said quietly. Full ride to UCLA, no strings attached. They feel responsible for what happened at the party. Aida's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. That's generous. It's charity, Sophia said, her voice carrying a bitterness that sounded unnervingly familiar. Kind, well-meaning charity from people who see our family's financial struggle as a problem they can solve with a checkbook. The recognition in Sophia's tone suggested she was finally understanding what Aida had experienced at the graduation party, the subtle condescension of being helped by people who couldn't comprehend the dignity that came with earning your own way. I turned them down, Sophia continued. Elena was shocked. She couldn't understand why I wouldn't just accept help from people who could afford to give it. Why did you refuse? Sophia met Aida's eyes directly for the first time since sitting down. Because I finally understand what you've been trying to teach me, that there's a difference between family support and charity. That accepting help you haven't earned comes with a cost to your dignity. The words hung between them, carrying the weight of lessons learned through loss rather than lecture. Aida felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition that Sophia was genuinely grappling with concepts that had previously been foreign to her. I also understand what my words cost you, Sophia said, her voice breaking slightly. Not just the money, though that's important, but the way I dismissed your sacrifice, the way I acted like your support was something to apologize for instead of celebrate. Aida set down her coffee cup, giving Sophia her full attention. I called you embarrassing because I was embarrassed, Sophia continued, tears beginning to flow. Not of you, but of myself. Of the fact that my college fund came from someone working double shifts instead of stock portfolios. Of the fact that my family drives old cars and shops at discount stores while my friends' families treat money like it's unlimited. The honesty was brutal and necessary. Aida saw her niece finally confronting the class shame that had poisoned their relationship. The internalized belief that financial struggle indicated moral failure rather than circumstance. But the embarrassing thing wasn't where the money came from, Sophia said. The embarrassing thing was that I was so ashamed of who we are that I forgot to be grateful for what you gave up for me. Frank appeared with a box of tissues, setting it between them with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that some conversations required props. Sophia accepted several gratefully, while Aida struggled with her own emotional response to hearing her sacrifice finally acknowledged. I'm sorry, Sophia said, the words carrying weight that her previous apologies had lacked. I'm sorry for calling you embarrassing. I'm sorry for taking your support for granted. I'm sorry for acting like your sacrifices were invisible. And I'm sorry that it took losing everything to make me understand what you were giving up for me. The apology was complete in a way that previous attempts had not been, acknowledging not just the words that had triggered the crisis, but the attitudes and assumptions that had made those words possible. I accept your apology, Aida said quietly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. But I owe you one too. Sophia looked up in confusion. For what? For taking that money knowing it would devastate your future. For letting my hurt feelings justify destroying your college plans. For responding to your cruelty with cruelty of my own. The mutual acknowledgement of harm done created space for something neither woman had expected. The possibility of rebuilding their relationship on more honest terms. I don't want all the money back, Sophia said suddenly. I know you need some of it for your retirement, for your own future. I want us to figure out a way forward that doesn't require you to disappear for my benefit. Aida felt tears she hadn't expected. What are you proposing? Sophia pulled another document from her folder, a handwritten letter that looked like it had been revised multiple times. I wrote this for you, she said. It's not a demand or a request, it's just what I think would be fair. For both of us. Aida accepted the letter, noting the careful penmanship and the visible evidence of crossouts and revisions. The document began simply, a proposal for rebuilding trust and sharing responsibility. I think you should keep $20,000 for your retirement, Sophia read aloud as Aida scanned the letter. You've earned the right to financial security, and I never want you to sacrifice your future for mine again. The proposal was detailed and thoughtful, acknowledging both Aida's need for financial security and Sophia's responsibility to contribute to her own education. It outlined a plan where Aida would return a portion of the college fund, while Sophia took on meaningful financial responsibility through work, loans, and delayed timelines. This would mean starting at community college, Aida observed, yes, and working 25 hours a week, and taking out student loans for the first time in my life. Sophia's voice was steady. It would mean earning my education instead of having it given to me. Frank appeared at their table, coffee pot in hand and concern in his eyes. Everything okay over here? We're talking, Aida said, which was perhaps the most hopeful thing she could have said under the circumstances. Good, Frank said simply, refilling their cups and retreating again. There's something else, Sophia said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I broke up with Brad. Aida raised an eyebrow. She'd forgotten about Sophia's boyfriend, a wealthy boy whose family owned several car dealerships, and who'd never worked a day in his life. He said I was being dramatic about the money situation. Said his family could easily cover my college costs and I was being stupid about accepting help. Sophia's smile was rueful. I realized I didn't want to be with someone who saw financial independence as stupidity. The decision represented more than a teenage breakup. It suggested Sophia was actively choosing to prioritize authentic values over social convenience. I'm proud of you, Aida said, meaning it completely. For breaking up with my boyfriend? For choosing self-respect over easy answers. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the week's revelations settling between them. Outside, the Friday afternoon traffic provided a familiar backdrop to their conversation, the everyday rhythms of working people heading home from jobs that paid the bills and made dreams possible. I have a confession, Aida said finally. I don't regret taking the money. Sophia looked up, startled. I regret hurting you. I regret the way I did it. But I don't regret forcing this conversation, forcing all of us to confront the truth about what our family dynamic had become. Aida's voice was steady. Someone needed to break the pattern, and apparently that someone was me. Even if it meant destroying my college plans? Your college plans were built on a lie anyway, Aida said gently. Better to destroy them and build something real than to continue pretending that sacrifice without acknowledgement is love. Rose's wisdom echoed in the words. The understanding that enabling behavior disguised as love could be more destructive than honest conflict. So where do we go from here? Sophia asked. Aida looked at the proposal letter, then at her niece, then at the familiar surroundings of the diner that had been both burden and sanctuary for 15 years. We try your plan, she said finally. I keep enough money to secure my own future, you take responsibility for earning yours, and we see if we can build a relationship based on mutual respect instead of obligation. And if it doesn't work, then at least we'll fail honestly instead of succeeding through lies. Frank emerged from the kitchen with a piece of pie he placed between them, apple, still warm, with 2 forks. His gesture was simple but meaningful, an offering of sweetness in the middle of difficult truths, a suggestion that reconciliation could be nourished through small acts of care. Thank you, Sophia said, accepting a fork, for this conversation, for giving me a chance to apologize properly, for not giving up on me completely. Thank you, Aida replied, for doing the work to understand what went wrong, for taking responsibility instead of just demanding forgiveness. They ate the pie in thoughtful silence, both aware that this conversation represented a beginning rather than an ending. Trust would need to be rebuilt gradually, through consistent actions rather than grand gestures. Respect would need to be earned rather than assumed. Love would need to be redefined in terms that honored both people's dignity rather than requiring one person's disappearance. But for the first time in a week, Sitting in a diner booth sharing pie with her niece, Aida Miller felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope that family relationships could evolve beyond the patterns that had trapped them for decades. Outside, the afternoon was giving way to evening, and the weekend stretched ahead with its possibilities for rest and reflection. The cashier's check in Aida's purse would be divided, some of it returning to serve Sophia's future, and some of it finally serving Aida's own long-deferred dreams. It wasn't the ending either of them had expected a week ago, but it was honest in a way their relationship had never been before. And sometimes, honesty was the only foundation strong enough to support the weight of real love. 2 weeks after the graduation party that had shattered their family's comfortable illusions, Aida Miller found herself in the unexpected position of planning for her own future. The cashier's check that had once felt like a weapon now lay divided across her kitchen table, $30,000 in a new account designated for Sophia's education, $17,832. $15 in a retirement fund that belonged entirely to Aida. The money felt different now. Not stolen or hoarded, but earned through 3 years of sacrifice that had finally been acknowledged and valued appropriately. For the first time since Michael's death, Aida could imagine a future that included rest, travel, maybe even the kind of small luxuries that made work feel like choice rather than survival. "You look different," Frank observed as he helped her clear breakfast dishes from the small table. They'd begun spending mornings together, tentative steps toward something that felt like courtship rather than the careful friendship that had sustained them through Aida's martyrdom years. Different how? Lighter, like you're not carrying the weight of the world anymore. Aida considered this as she rinsed plates in the small sink. The constant tension that had lived in her shoulders for 3 years had gradually loosened over the past 2 weeks. Sleep came easier now that she wasn't calculating overtime shifts in her dreams. Food tasted better when she wasn't eating peanut butter sandwiches to save money for someone else's future. "I feel guilty about that," she admitted. "About feeling relieved when Sophia's still struggling with the consequences of my decision." "Good guilt or destructive guilt?" Frank asked, a question his daughter Sarah had taught him to ask during their own reconciliation process. "Good guilt, I think. The kind that reminds me I'm human, not the kind that makes me want to fix everything again." Through her kitchen window, Aida could see the neighborhood coming to life on Saturday morning. Children riding bikes, parents working in gardens, teenagers gathered on stoops. The ordinary rhythms of life that she'd missed while working constant double shifts. She was rediscovering the pleasure of weekend mornings, of having energy for something other than survival. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "First day at Home Depot. Wish me luck." Aida smiled, typing back, "You've got this. Proud of you." Sophia had surprised everyone by how quickly she'd adapted to her new circumstances. Within a week of their diner conversation, she'd enrolled in community college classes, applied for a part-time job at the home improvement store, and begun the process of applying for scholarships she'd previously ignored. The transformation hadn't been without tears and frustration, but it had been thorough. "She's growing up fast," Frank observed, reading over Aida's shoulder. "She had to. That's what happens when you stop protecting people from reality." Rosa's voice echoed in the observation, the understanding that love sometimes required allowing people to struggle rather than rescuing them from every difficulty. "Carmen called this morning," Aida said, settling back at the table with fresh coffee. "Sophia's been helping her research refinancing options for the house. Apparently the girl who couldn't be bothered to understand how college funds worked is now reading mortgage documents. Crisis has a way of revealing people's actual capabilities. Or developing them." Frank reached across the table and covered Aida's hand with his own, a gesture that had become comfortable over the past 2 weeks. "Any regrets about how things worked out?" Aida considered the question honestly. "About the way I handled it? Yes. I could have confronted the problem without devastating an 18-year-old's immediate future." She paused, watching steam rise from her coffee cup. "But about forcing the conversation that needed to happen? No. Someone had to break the pattern. The pattern had been insidious. Michael's irresponsibility enabled by Aida's generosity, Carmen's gratitude mixed with dependence, Sophia's expectations without understanding. It had taken a crisis to reveal how thoroughly they'd all been trapped in roles that served no one's long-term interests. "Rosa wants to cook dinner for everyone tomorrow," Aida said. "Her birthday, family gathering, the whole thing. First time we'll all be in the same room since you blew up their lives?" "Since I blew up their lives." Aida agreed with a rueful smile. The dinner invitation had come with Rosa's characteristic directness. "Enough hiding in corners feeling sorry for yourselves. Time to practice being a family that tells the truth." At 82, Rosa had no patience for extended drama or careful emotional processing. Problems got addressed, lessons got learned, life moved forward. "You nervous?" Frank asked. "Terrified," Aida admitted, "but also curious. We're all different people than we were 2 weeks ago. I want to see who we become when we're together." The afternoon passed quietly. Aida worked in her small garden, something she'd neglected during her overtime years, while Frank assembled a bookshelf he'd brought over. Domestic activities that felt revolutionary after 3 years of having no energy for anything beyond work and family obligation. At 5 o'clock, Sophia called. "How was the first day?" Aida asked, settling into her kitchen chair. "Exhausting. My feet hurt, my back hurts, and I smell like lumber and fertilizer." Sophia's voice was tired but oddly satisfied. "I also learned how to operate a forklift and helped a contractor calculate materials for a deck renovation." "Sounds productive." It was. "And Tia? I made $64 today." "Not much, but it's mine. I earned it myself." The pride in Sophia's voice was unmistakable, the satisfaction that came from exchanging work for wages rather than simply receiving money from others. Aida remembered that feeling from her first job, the dignity of independence even when the pay was modest. "That's wonderful, Misha." "I wanted to ask you something," Sophia continued, her tone becoming more serious. "Tomorrow at Abuela's, are we going to be okay? As a family, I mean." Aida considered the question, watching Frank through the window as he swept sawdust from her porch. "We're going to be different. Whether that means we're okay depends on whether everyone can accept the new version of who we are. What if Mom can't handle the changes? What if she's still angry about the money? Then we'll deal with that honestly too. Your mother has had to confront some hard truths about enabling behavior and financial dependence. That's not easy at any age." "And you? Are you still angry at me?" Aida felt the question settle in her chest, testing it against the complicated mix of love, disappointment, and cautious hope that defined her current feelings toward her niece. "I'm not angry anymore," she said finally. "But I'm not the same person I was before either. We're going to have to learn how to love each other without anyone disappearing in the process." "I can live with that," Sophia said quietly. "I think I prefer it, actually. Being loved as who I really am instead of who someone wants me to be." After ending the call, Aida sat in her kitchen watching the evening light fade over her neighborhood. Frank had finished his project and was reading on her small couch, comfortable in her space in a way that suggested possibility rather than assumption. Tomorrow would test whether their family could function on new terms, with boundaries instead of endless sacrifice, with honesty instead of protective lies, with mutual respect instead of roles that required someone's diminishment. It wouldn't be easy. Trust had been broken and would need time to heal. Old patterns would reassert themselves and require constant vigilance to prevent. But for the first time in 3 years, Aida Miller was entering a family gathering as a complete person, rather than someone whose primary function was to solve other people's problems. She had her own money, her own plans, her own life that existed independent of her utility to others. The retirement account in her name contained enough to change her future in real ways. Not enough to quit working entirely, but enough to choose part-time hours, to plan actual vacations, to date Frank openly without worrying about the time and energy it took away from family obligations. "Ready for tomorrow?" Frank asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway. as ready as anyone can be for reinventing their family. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Not the easy thing, not the comfortable thing, but the necessary thing. Aida stood and moved to where he waited, accepting the embrace that felt like coming home to herself. Outside, the neighborhood settled into Saturday evening routines. Families gathering for dinner, children called in from play. The ordinary magic of lives being lived rather than simply endured. Tomorrow would bring Rosa's birthday dinner, and the test of whether love could survive the requirement of honesty. Whether Carmen could accept help without dependence. Whether Sophia could maintain her new understanding of dignity and work. Whether Aida could balance generosity with self-preservation. The answers weren't guaranteed. Healthy relationships required constant attention and adjustment, the willingness to have difficult conversations before they became family-destroying crises. But for the first time since Michael's death, those conversations would happen between equals, rather than between a martyr and her beneficiaries. It wasn't the ending any of them had expected 3 weeks ago, but it was honest in a way their previous dynamic had never been. And sometimes, Aida reflected as Frank's arms tightened around her, honesty was the only foundation strong enough to support the weight of real love. The work of rebuilding would take time, but tonight, in her own kitchen with her own money in her own account, Aida Miller was finally ready to begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,